Okay, let's dive right into this explainer and completely dismantle a historical myth that, well, we've pretty much all been taught since elementary school. Simplifying history is a really natural consequence of time passing. But today, we're going to look at the fascinating, messy, and highly collaborative reality behind one of humanity's greatest leaps forward.
It is the universal symbol for a great idea, right? A little cartoon light bulb pops up over someone's head, and we immediately know they've just had a stroke of genius. But I want you to ask yourself right now, who actually invented the light bulb? I'm willing to bet the name Thomas Alva Edison immediately sprang to mind.
Now, the sheer scale of the reality here is just staggering compared to the myth. The myth tells us Edison was this lone genius who had a sudden eureka moment in his Menlo Park laboratory back in 1879. But the reality? Over 24 brilliant scientists were innovating, experimenting, and successfully building light bulbs from 1802 onward. Edison was simply the finish line of a massive relay race that involved dozens of brilliant minds passing the baton across decades and continents.
So let's kick things off with Section 1, Pioneers Before the Bulb.
The early discoveries in this field happened incredibly fast. Starting in 1800, Alessandro Volta was the very first person to notice that electricity could heat a copper wire until it literally glowed. Just 2 years later, in 1802, Humphrey Davy deliberately created an incandescent light using a platinum strip exposed to the air. Fast forward a bit to 1860, and a German-born mechanic named Heinrich Goebel, also known as Henry, is already illuminating his New York optics shop with his own homemade glass tube bulbs to attract customers. Think about that. He was doing this a full 2 decades before Edison's famous patent.
So the crucial thing to understand is that these early attempts didn't fail because of a lack of scientific genius, but rather due to fatal practical flaws in materials or honestly just a simple lack of financial backing. Davy's platinum, for instance, was incredibly innovative because it had a high melting point, but it was way too expensive and not bright enough for everyday use. Over in England, Joseph Swan had working lamps using carbonized paper and a partial vacuum, but they burned out way too quickly. And the team of Woodward and Evans, they had a brilliant design using a carbon rod and nitrogen, but their fatal flaw was simply that they couldn't get the money to produce it.
Which brings us nicely to Section 2, the Forgotten Canadian Innovators.
In 1874, Henry Woodward and Matthew Evans devised this brilliant 3-step process that resulted in a highly effective incandescent lamp. They reasoned that passing current through a high-resistance filament would cause it to glow. So first, they developed a high-resistance carbon rod. Next, they ingeniously housed it inside a glass tube taken right off a piece of industrial machinery, a boiler-level indicator. Finally, to keep the carbon from instantly catching fire and burning up, they replaced the air inside the tube with nitrogen.
You can literally feel the magic of their discovery in this quote from Matthew Evans. He's describing their 1874 test, where they coupled the electrodes to the terminals of an industrial battery in a Toronto foundry. He recalls, "Gradually, we saw the carbon become first red and gradually lighter and lighter in color until it beamed forth in beautiful light." I mean, just imagine sitting in the dark around a workbench and witnessing artificial light beaming forth like that. It must have been absolutely revolutionary.
But here is the heartbreaking reality of this whole situation. Woodward and Evans tried desperately to find financial backers, but instead of being hailed as visionaries, they were completely dismissed. They were ridiculed by investors who thought this was a quote-unquote useless invention. Starved of funding and completely unable to refine their prototype, they just gave up. In 1879, they sold their US patent rights to none other than Thomas Edison for a mere $5,000. That's only about $100,000 in today's money, a tiny, tiny fraction of what the industry would soon be worth.
Let's move on to Section 3, Edison's true commercial genius.
If you take away anything from this explainer, let it be this. Edison's true genius lay in creating the entire interconnected infrastructure that allowed the bulb to transition from a quirky laboratory curiosity into a household staple. He fully realized that a light bulb was completely useless if you didn't have a way to actually generate and distribute power to people's homes to turn the thing on.
Edison essentially built a massive, complex puzzle. First, he secured incredibly deep-pocketed Wall Street funding from titans like J.P. Morgan and the Vanderbilts. He famously declared, "We will make electricity so cheap that only the rich will burn candles." Then, his team tirelessly searched for a better filament, eventually discovering a carbonized bamboo fiber, supposedly inspired by a bamboo fishing pole Edison recalled from a trip to Wyoming that could last over 1,200 hours. Crucially, he built New York's first electric distribution grid, the Pearl Street Station, providing the direct current needed to run the lamps. And finally, he brought in top-tier engineering talent to make it all scale.
And speaking of that engineering talent, we absolutely have to highlight Lewis Latimer. Latimer was a phenomenally gifted engineer and draftsman. Before he even joined Edison's company in 1884, Latimer had already received an 1881 patent for an improved process of manufacturing carbons. It was this specific manufacturing process that made mass-producing these carbon filaments actually feasible. Seriously, without Latimer's contribution, Edison's dream of cheap, widespread lighting would have remained impossibly expensive to manufacture.
Okay, let's get into the corporate drama in Section 4, the brutal patent wars.
The legal chaos of this era was just staggering. Edison didn't just invent something and walk away victorious. In the UK, he was actually sued by Joseph Swan for patent infringement, and Swan won. Then, in 1883, the US Patent Office dealt a massive blow to Edison, ruling his patent completely invalid because it was based on the prior art of a man named William Sawyer. It took nearly 6 years of endless litigation until an 1889 ruling by a US judge finally validated Edison's specific claim for a high-resistance carbon filament.
Now remember Heinrich Goebel, the optics shop owner from 1860? Well, his intricate work came back to haunt Edison's empire. Goebel's process was to strip a piece of bamboo cane, grind it hair-thin, bend it into a hairpin shape over a hot iron, pack it into a coal mold, and then bake it airtight overnight. It is shockingly similar to what Edison's team supposedly discovered from scratch decades later.
So the crazy part is, when Edison's company sued the firms making Goebel lamps in 1893, Goebel actually produced witnesses, including physics professors, who proved he had these lamps back in 1860. An American court actually acknowledged the priority of Goebel's invention over Edison's. But in a really tragic twist of fate, Goebel passed away that very same year at the age of 75. His heirs, who were likely exhausted and completely outgunned by Edison's corporate lawyers, just let the matter drop. If they had fought it to the bitter end, the history books might be entirely rewritten today.
Meanwhile, across the Atlantic, the story ended a little bit differently. To avoid mutually assured destruction and the incredibly expensive British courts, bitter rivals Edison and Swan simply decided to join forces. In 1883, they formed the Edison Company. It was the ultimate corporate compromise. The glass bulbs they sold in Britain were actually of Swan's design, while the filaments inside were of Edison's design. Together, they absolutely dominated the market.
Finally, let's wrap things up with Section 5, a legacy of collaborative light.
Even today, over a century later, when you screw a standard light bulb into a socket in your house, you're likely using the E26 screw. This 1-inch diameter, 7 threads per inch base became the absolute standard for 120-volt circuits in the US by 1908. And that E, it officially stands for Edison. By standardizing the hardware, Edison quite literally cemented his name into the very foundation of modern electricity.
But knowing what we know now about this incredible relay race of innovation, from Volta and Davy to Goebel, Swan, Woodward, Evans, and Latimer, I want to leave you with this thought. If the greatest invention in history wasn't a solo light bulb moment, but rather the result of decades of collaborative science mixed with ruthless business acumen, what other lone geniuses in our history books are actually just brilliant marketers? Think about that next time you flip a switch. Thanks for watching this explainer, and keep questioning the history you think you know.